The Diabetes Podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease. Please do not apply any of this information without first speaking to your doctor.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Diabetes Podcast. I'm Dr. Garrett, and with me is Dr. Grady Donahoe. And today we are talking about leaky gut and type 1 diabetes.
Oh, yeah.
Grady, what are your thoughts on leaky gut?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on leaky gut, which is why this might be a longer podcast than we expect. Because this is a very important topic. Because, I think it's a common talking point for a lot of people in the health field right now, as far as just overall gut health and how it impacts pretty much your overall health in general. So kind of most people's philosophy in the functional medicine world is start with the gut and then go from there, because that's kind of your foundation as far as your health goes.
Right. And I think it makes a lot of sense in both our minds to start with the gut and go from there. But with such a intro to anyone and everyone listening, this will be a much more science based discussion than some of our more bro-y related buddy type episodes. So we're also going to kind of talk about one paper that we thought was significant and kind of easy to talk about in a podcast format on the subject. But yeah, no, I agree with you. You're absolutely right. It's such a important conversation. And I think the validity of what is leaky gut and it being a real thing continues to grow every day, every month, every year as time passes. So how do we want to start this, Grady?
Well, we can talk about what is leaky gut and what does that mean.
Sure. So leaky gut, or what might be a more appropriate or more scientific accurate name, is intestinal permeability, right? So leaky gut is the idea that our gut is made up of cells, our intestines, and in between those cells are certain amounts of structures that are supposed to be barriers and limit what goes in and out. Because when you actually think about your digestion, this might be a weird concept for most to think about, is our digestion is actually outside of our body. We eat food, it goes into our mouth, into our esophagus, and that's like a donut, right? So think of your mouth hole as a donut hole, and
of course you would use donut.
Well, it's is absolutely the best way to describe something like this. So don't worry, I haven't had donuts in a while. And so as you eat, it goes through your mouth, down your esophagus to your stomach. It still hasn't entered you. It's still on the outside of you. And as it continues to digest through your stomach and your intestines, it's still in the middle of that donut hole. And then it continues down your intestines, through your rectum, and out your bowels. And that pathway is 100% not inside of you. It's it's enclosed around you. But when you eat, and any food that goes through your mouth and out your bottom is never actually inside you.
Yeah. So it's essentially, it's in your GI tract, but it's not in your actual system. It's not inside your body, in your tissues, in your cells. So that ultimately comes down to your gut lining being a semi-permeable barrier. And by semi-permeable, I mean it is selectively bringing things in that should be, and keeping things out that should not be in your system. And so when we start having hyperpermeability, so more permeability than what is normal, which is kind of what we're talking about here with leaky gut, then you are getting things in that should not be coming in. So when we start having hyperpermeability, that usually means that the tight junctions that are between cells are now becoming looser and allowing bigger things into the system that should not be in, or not necessarily bigger things, but just things that should not be getting in, because otherwise the cell would never bring it in otherwise. And so when those tight junctions start to loosen up and start to break apart, you're getting things in that shouldn't be getting in. And therefore your immune system says, hey, you should not be here. get out of here, and it starts attacking it. And then that's kind of where this whole process starts, is when your immune system starts to get involved. Because obviously, as type 1 diabetics, as autoimmune patients, we are worried about our immune system and how that's impacting our development of said condition, because that's
Right.
largely by the immune system.
Yeah. So you just made a good leap, and I wanted to connect those dots and reiterate the importance of what you just said. So as we describe what leaky gut is, the reason why we want to talk about it is because there's a connection between this condition of increased intestinal permeability with those tight junctions and autoimmunity. And one can think, and that's what research is trying to figure out, how and why one is related to the other. How is a leaky gut state related to your autoimmune state, which what you just said, as type 1 diabetics, we all are. So the more we can understand about leaky gut, we are essentially adding weight to possible mechanisms and possible reasons why somebody might become type 1 diabetic in their life.
Yeah, and once you can find the reason for developing a certain condition, it becomes a lot easier to try and develop a way to then help with that condition, or maybe sometimes reverse that condition.
Right. Bold words said on podcast. Reverse
Yeah.
the condition. uh, so so essentially those tight junctions between the intestinal cells are physical proteins. They're physical barriers, and those can be broken down through a variety of reasons. And there's a variety of hypotheses out there on what could or could not cause, this increased intestinal permeability. So we actually found a paper. This is from 2006 in the Diabetes Journal. So this is on the American Diabetes Association, and this is in their diabetes journal, entitled Zonulin Upregulation is associated with increased gut permeability in subjects with type 1 diabetes and their relatives. Now, we're not going to go line by line like we've tried to do in the past or anything like that. We're going to try to be much more communicative about this paper and just kind of talk about what this is. And yeah, it's from 2006. It's, maybe 15 years old ish, around that time frame. And but even in the past 5-10 years, 2 years, there's a lot of connections between intestinal permeability and leaky gut. But this one in particular, I think, explains a lot of things really well.
Yeah, because it looks at several different scenarios and also different markers for it as well.
So do you want to maybe explain zonulin before we get into some of the things about the paper?
Yeah, so zonulin, two words that kind of go hand in hand with leaky gut or hyperpermeability is zonulin and occludin. There's some other molecules that are involved, but those are kind of the two, catch words that most people are going to focus in on because they're the big players in this whole process. And so occludins are essentially the proteins that are holding that tight junction together, whereas zonulin is a protein that is involved in the disassembly of those tight junctions, and it kind of leads towards that intestinal permeability.
Right. So essentially the general hypothesis is the more zonulin you have, the more breakdown of tight junctions, in this case occludin, but there's various other proteins. It's not just a one bridge, one brand name of a bridge in the tight junction. You break down the tight junctions, that increases the space in between those cells, therefore the permeability for things to slide through, like you've already explained. So the thought is then more zonulin, more intestinal permeability, aka leaky gut, more issues. So in this paper, they ended up, they do a really good job at setting the stage and talking about, how they started getting to some of the research they ended up doing. But they took 339 type 1 diabetic patients. And because we know that type 1 diabetes has some genetic component, they were looking at direct relatives of those diabetic, and they looked at 89 of those. And then they ended up looking at 97 control subjects that were similar to the type 1 diabetic subjects. So this is not an animal model study. This is not a theory, like in practice, or only in theory would this happen in practice type of study. This is what's happening with real people and real patients right now, which
Mm-hmm.
I think shouldn't be understated,
Yeah.
because a lot of people want to, say leaky gut's not a thing because of how much it's studied in animals and not enough in people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's, I mean, it's, and pertaining to this podcast, it's directly on type 1 diabetics. It's not on like another autoimmune disease. This is
Mhm.
looking at type 1 diabetics.
Right. And so even, 13, I'm around a level 13 type 1 diabetic. I believe you are too, 13 years being diabetic. And even in the 2000s, they were saying how there's genetic, but there's this big environmental component. And part of this quest is say, what is that environmental component? And how does environment, not always what environment, but how does environment play a role in type 1 diabetes?
Yeah. Yeah. Cause they highlighted in the intro here, and I think it's something I think everybody should take note of, and because it's really important, which is the observation that less than 10% of subjects with genetic susceptibility to this disease um, actually actually develop it. And so that kind of points at it's not a purely genetic thing. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
genetics may play a bit of a role in it, but
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, our environment and what we put into our body and all the things that our body has to handle is going to be affecting whether we're going to be developing this disease or not.
Mm-hmm. And that's why part of the rise in type 1 diabetes diagnosis is because there's something in the environment that's going on, or rather, us as individuals in the environment,
Mm-hmm.
which is what this is connecting. This article essentially in Leaky Gut Connects, um, and increases the frequency of that type 1 diabetes diagnosis. I mean, my first type 1 diabetic patient got diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at 69 years old.
Wow.
And unfortunately, he just like passed away a year or two ago. Not a year or two, like a week or two ago. I don't know why I said
Oh.
but he just passed away. I only had a few months working with him. But even in your 40s, 50s, 60s, because autoimmunity is rising, it's not a scary thing, but it's wow, what are we doing? How can we learn more and do more, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So with it somehow environment playing a role, framing the question, what is different about us? And this is where this comes in, right? So
Mm-hmm.
by looking at these patients, they essentially did three studies, and then they talked about these three different types of studies. They looked at these patients that we described, the type ones, the relatives, and the controls, and they looked at serum zonulin, so how much of that zonulin is in their blood. And then they looked at they did a urine test, then essentially measured the intestinal permeability that we'll talk about, and then they tried looking at genetic factors, genetic expression of the tight junctions. Those are like the three things they really looked at in this paper to try to connect type 1 diabetes and leaky gut.
Mm-hmm.
So the first was serum zonulins. What was going on with that?
Yeah, so serum zonulins were elevated in the type 1 diabetes group relative to the relatives. Um, and then
Relative to the
also,
relatives.
yeah. And then both the type 1 diabetes group and the relatives group were also elevated relative to the normal group. So
Mm-hmm.
to put it into numbers, they didn't have their units on there, but it was 0.85 for the type 1 diabetic group, whereas the relatives group was 0.62, and then the normal group was 0.21.
Mm-hmm.
And so, just to kind of put it into a better perspective, 42% of the type 1 diabetics were outside of 2 standard deviations from the normal group. So that means there was a lot more of those type 1 diabetics that were much farther out of range in that of the zonulin um, than the relatives, because the relatives were only 29%. And then obviously the normals were only 4% of them were outside 2 standard deviations.
And so, to put even in more layman's terms, I mean, that's stuff I really want to know about. But to put it even more layman's terms, it's type 1 diabetics were actually way more, had statistically way more zonulin in their blood, compared to the controls and even compared to the relatives. And in the paper, figure one, is a beautiful, like, it's just such a clear representation of them shooting up and
Mhm.
how many of their patients and the people that they looked at, fall under these categories of type 1 diabetics with zonulin. So they essentially concluded, hey, type 1 diabetics have more zonulin. And we just kind of explained how zonulin has been shown to increase, the breakdown of those tight junctions and therefore possibly leaky gut. So, but all they can say from that one type of study is type 1 diabetics in this study have more zonulin. So that's a piece of evidence, right?
Mhm.
So then they looked at, a urine test called the lactulose and mannitol test, which is a urine test that they essentially, do an overnight fast, and then the patients drink a solution of lactulose and mannitol, which is a mixture of water. So essentially, they're having sugar and sugar-like, sugar alcohol in a liquid, and then they're collecting the urine and seeing how much ends up in the urine. Now, if you think about the gut, that might be confusing. Well, I thought gut equaled poop, but but the body's a little more, complicated than that. So they're able to show still data nonetheless, and they kind of describe it in the paper how and why that ends up being relative to intestinal permeability. But in all, for this purpose, we can say this urine test is equals intestinal permeability. So what do they find, Doc?
Yeah, so they had increased intestinal. I mean, it was essentially they found very similar stuff to what they had found with the zonulin,
Mm-hmm.
where they had increased permeability with the type 1 diabetic group, and then a little bit increased for the relatives,
Mm-hmm.
and then obviously the normal group was much less than both.
Right, right. And so it was still statistically significant. So the amount of lactulose to mannitol was still significant, statistically significant, which means from a stats, and like that phrase is like a scientific like gold standard. If you don't have your data statistically significant, it's like it's not really worth talking about.
Yeah.
So their data is worth talking about, that they had higher intestinal permeability through this test in the type 1 diabetic population. But what was interesting is that in that ratio, there was way more lactulose than mannitol. And in the test, the more lactulose you have ends up being more, paracellular breakthrough compared to transcellular. So what that means is paracellular is, the lactulose gets through in between the cells, versus mannitol, which was transcellular, would break through the cells and kind of go through, literally, if you think of a cell as a square, would go straight down the middle and just kind of almost, like a red rover, send mannitol right over kind of thing. and but there was more paracellular or more lactulose, than mannitol, so which ends up correlating in the hypothesis of how leaky gut and tight junction breakdown ends up happening, which I thought was an interesting part that they were included in the paper.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, they took that data, and then they took the zonulin data, and then they essentially tried making a correlation graph, and they plotted these two things against one another, and they were able to show that the urine test and the serum zonulin showed a significant coefficient of correlation, meaning there was a correlation between the type 1 diabetics and these subjects that they tested, of how much zonulin you had, and then how much lactose or lactulose and mannitol they had in their urine, which was, that point in itself is really important, because it's one thing to say, okay, high zonulin. They also had high lactulose, but when you put them together and there's still a significant correlation between the two, now we can start connecting dots from an evidence perspective, which is really, really important.
Yeah, yeah. Two parameters that indicate, intestinal permeability, and they're both showing the same essential correlation. The data is very similar.
Right. So, that takes a lot of weight, I think, as practitioners for us, and Because what we have to do as practitioners is we see something, we see if it's legit or not, and then if it's safe, and there's enough data to support it, which this is just one paper. There's multiple other types of data out there to say, can we act on this? But when you start to combine, like you just said, these things, we can really increase our confidence in some of these correlations between one another.
Mm-hmm.
So last thing they looked at in this paper then was the tight junction gene expression, which essentially was a dud.
Yeah.
Because they did find some upregulation and some downregulation and other, but there was nothing there that was actually statistically significant, which would have helped the case even more. But when you look at when you start to think about, okay, a bigger physiology and organ perspective versus a cellular gene expression and epigenetic expression, those are two very different things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it makes sense, and it's not that big of a downfall that they didn't have any data for the tight junction expression. What were your thoughts on that part of the paper?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it made sense that ultimately the gene expression part wasn't as big of a player in the whole process, and it seems like that kind of helps the notion or the thought process of, okay, let's not necessarily focus on the genes themselves. Let's try and focus on what's affecting maybe the genes, or maybe just affecting this whole process of the increased zonulin, and trying to figure out why that is increased and why that may be causing that scenario.
Mm-hmm. So that being said, I mean, what does this all look like and clinically, and what's the point of all this? We get to this end of the paper and say, okay, cool, there might be more zonulin, more intestinal permeability in type 1 diabetic patients, but so what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So ultimately, it's about figuring out, like I said, why is that zonulin increased, and what can we do to help reduce that and reduce the intestinal permeability. And so, I mean, it doesn't get into it in this paper as far as what causes the zonulin to increase. It's just showing kind of the correlation of zonulin and that going on. But there has been studies on, general leaky gut and some things that cause it. And so it's about identifying those triggers and identifying what is causing leaky gut. And for each person, that is going to be different, unfortunately, which is the sucky thing about health and the human body and being a doctor, is trying to figure out why this person is in this position and why their body is doing what it is doing. Because ultimately, the body is trying to heal itself, is trying to do the right thing. But we have to make the right choices as practitioners, as patients, throughout our day and in our lives, to help make sure our body can function at its best capacity. And so we have to look at what are the most common things and what are the things that are impacting you. So obviously diet is a huge component of what's going on in the gut, because if you have a lot of inflammation in the gut, that's typically going to lead to more of that leaky gut scenario. And so inflammation is just a broad term, and there's a lot of things that can cause inflammation. But I will say in my practice, I find that the large majority of inflammation in people's bodies comes from what they're putting in their mouth. And part of the reason for that is because, 60 to 80%, depending on what study you look at, of your immune system is located in your gut and in that gut lining. So if you're bringing stuff in that your body doesn't like, then you're going to be causing a lot more inflammation and triggering a lot more things going on there.
Right. And so to connect a few more dots, inflammation, immune system. So your immune system is what literally creates the signals of inflammation.
Mm-hmm.
It's not good. And we've talked about this on the podcast before. It's not good nor bad. It just is by itself. But when you have
Mm-hmm.
it chronically, that's an issue. And in fact, inflammation is a good thing in an acute scenario. But when you have it too long, it starts creating havoc in your gut. And if you have most of your immune system in your gut, and that's chronically sending what you're eating, sending signals to your immune system to create inflammation, that's a pretty big issue. So they didn't talk about this too much in the paper. They did in their discussion, but I don't think there's any point in repeating somebody else's summation
Thoughts. Yeah.
of thoughts, right? On this type of podcast. If you want to read it, you can. We'll probably link it in the podcast notes. But how does all right? So you've got leaky gut. So what's the issue then? If you have leaky gut to your immune system and inflammation, what's that connection there?
Yeah. Yeah. So furthering our story of how we're getting from leaky gut to type 1 diabetes is when you have things leaking through that barrier and being exposed to your immune system there. Your immune system, like I said before, it says, hey, you're not supposed to be here. Get out of here. We're going to try and kill you now. And when that starts occurring over and over and more frequently, your immune system kind of goes, into attack mode and just wants to attack anything that looks even remotely foreign, because it's just there's so much coming at it that it's not used to seeing. And so a lot of those things that are getting in, whether that's from the diet or other things, sometimes can look enough alike some of your tissues in your body, and therefore your immune system will start attacking those specific tissues because it looks enough like a foreign invader that was coming in. And so it's like, hey, you're not supposed to be here either, and we're going to start attacking you as well.
Yeah. So essentially, with the walls breaking down, the bounce are gone, the junction's bigger, more permeability, allows more things up. And that's when that immune system interacts with it and starts doing that attack. So you have more permeability, more bigger things to get through. And so when you eat, ultimately, a lot of that should be going into your body anyways. However, if it doesn't have the proper amount of time to digest, if it doesn't make it through enough of your intestines, if it's not, you don't have enzymes, whatever have be, if that molecule that's not ready to go to your body is allowed to go there through this breaking, and the bouncer is not there to interact with your immune system and start attacking it, that's the biggest issue. So for argument's sake, you could eat a hot dog, and a hot dog is a bad example for you because you're going to just shake your head at it. But if you are able to have a hot dog without any inflammation, that's because you're supposed to digest it fully and properly, and all its components. I don't know why I'm thinking about hot dogs, probably because baseball's back, but all the components of the hot dog should be broken down and transported through the intestinal wall and then into your blood at a size and shape where your immune system doesn't think of it as foreign. And then if it does, that's because it's too big. And so what's going on? This isn't a hot dog bun. This is something crazy, and it's just a hot dog bun but bigger. But your immune system doesn't know that. It just thinks about it in parts.
Yeah. So essentially, to kind of sum that up, essentially when you're digesting your food, it should be getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller via enzymes and chewing and all that stuff until it's at those amino acids. And essentially, you're going to be absorbing those smaller components like amino acids in, and that's what's supposed to get in. So if you're digesting really well and you even have maybe some leaky gut, but it's still at that small component, well, your immune system wants that. So it's going to take that in and it's not going to think anything of it. But if you're getting things that are coming through that are bigger, like bigger proteins that are multiple amino acids long that aren't supposed to be coming in, your immune system's like, hey, this isn't supposed to be here. And now we're going to start attacking it.
Right. So, all right, well, that's fine. Let's say somebody listens to this and accepts this, right? Or we tell this to our patients, like, makes sense, but how does the autoimmunity happen? Where our my immune system attacks it, it is foreign. It's not supposed to be there. So it tries to tag it to get destroyed. So somebody might think, how does that lead to type 1 diabetes? What's that connection then?
Yeah. So there's a couple different hypotheses out there. I think the one that I think about the most, or what I use the most as far as describing to patients, is kind of the molecular mimicry, where essentially your immune system starts thinking, or it looks. So let's say we have a piece of hot dog that comes in that's bigger than it should be.
I got Grady to talk about hot dogs. Continue.
So a piece of hot dog that comes in that's bigger than it should be, and your immune system starts attacking it. So it's creating antibodies and antigens, antibodies against that. And so now those antibodies are going to be triggering anything that looks remotely like that, for your immune system to start attacking. So for different people, that's different systems. For us as type 1 diabetics, that ends up being our pancreas. So our pancreas starts to look enough like something that's getting in, as that's your immune system is tagging it as foreign. And then it's like, okay, we got to start attacking this now because this isn't supposed to be here anymore.
Mm-hmm. And so then you actually then develop those antibodies for that tissue.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a hot dog, and this is all, an example. There is no study that says hot dog leads to beta cell, pancreatic islet cell antibodies, but maybe there is. I don't know. But
maybe the bun part.
um, so you have the antibodies to the bun, and then the bun looks like the beta cells, and then your memory cells, the memory part of your adaptive immune system, then starts to create more antibodies that look like that, which end up
Mm-hmm.
being that tissue type. So maybe I already said, pancreatic islet cell antibodies, and then
Mm-hmm.
you start having those more and more, and then you have these antibodies that your immune system will see and start to get tagged and start to attack those tissue types. So there's actually an animal study article that came out, I believe, in like June, July of 2019, that we won't talk about, but we can link it. It actually had all these steps in an animal model of leaky gut, intestinal permeability, and then upregulation of immune system and antibodies and type 1 diabetes, all in the same paper of mice and rats. And it was like, it was funny because I literally saw it, I think, the day after it came out without an alert. I was just like
No,
on
yeah.
PubMed just reading anyways, and then I was like, this was yesterday. And it was just kind of fun.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so that's the step, and that's the thought, is that with more intestinal permeability, your immune system will be up higher, and with a more agitated and aggravated immune system, the likelihood of autoimmunity and in this case type 1 diabetes is higher.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So
I
then
don't
the question becomes being, how do we get this immune system to calm back down, and how do we maybe even prevent it from getting to that point?
right. So and the age old question, you know did you eat yourself? Does what you eat lead to the diagnosis of type 1 diabetes? And these questions are, interesting to ask and think about. So yeah, what you eat affects your gut, affects your immune system, and therefore possibly diabetes. There isn't, like, we're not saying that you can eat your way out of diabetes. We're not saying sugar is the reason why you're type 1 diabetic in this mechanism of type 1 diabetes, but man, all the data does suggest that what you eat affects your gut, and that affects your immune system.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So again, back to my burst my beta cells from a few podcasts ago about
Mm-hmm.
eating whatever I want, and I just have to take insulin. Yeah, that doesn't work so well when your immune system's involved.
Right. Because when people ask that question, and I see that this is, I feel like we're getting more and more against the the common type 1 community on social media, of saying, like, you know, does what you eat cause type 1 diabetes? No, but maybe.
Yeah.
And obviously that phrase is, like I said, relevant to how much sugar someone, like, that's what people think,
Yeah.
but it's way more complicated than that. And your beta cells, reminiscing on that, it's, can you eat it, or should you eat it, or
Yeah.
is it possible or is it not possible? It's out there, and because of the data that's out there. And I want to remind everyone who's been sticking around to this episode, the article we discussed, for 10, 15, 20 minutes, was the Diabetes Journal from the American Diabetes Association.
Mm-hmm.
Like this, and I don't know why it's not talked about enough in hospitals and dietitians, diabetes educators. Maybe it is, that's not our profession. Maybe diabetes educators these days are talking about leaky gut. That would be awesome if they were. When we were diagnosed, they weren't talking about it,
Oh no.
even that this paper was out by then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So This is something that is legitimate and worth discussing, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I wish it was discussed more in the mainstream,
Mm-hmm.
whether it be the medical field and just the type 1 diabetic community in general, because it can really open your eyes to what maybe is actually possible with this condition. Because after learning about all this stuff, um, and and how it's affecting your immune system, and how your immune system is obviously a player in autoimmune diseases, it's like, holy crap, like, could I reverse what's going on right now?
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, it comes down to what got me here and what got my immune system here. And ultimately, that is a very complex question. But one
Mm-hmm.
of the biggest answers in that equation is your diet. And so that's kind of where your foundation is. So if your diet is promoting health, then you're going to be much more well off. If it's not promoting health, then it's going to be a lot harder to get better function.
So I think you had some interesting personal experience of have you tried to reverse your own diabetes, Grady?
I have,
You've
and I
tried.
still am. I still am.
Mm.
I still have hopes that
Oh wow.
that I can figure it out.
Mm.
Because
Normally
I've
I'm normally I'm the hopeful one.
because I haven't tried everything, and there's still a lot of things that I have to work through with getting my body functioning better. And but ultimately, there was a point where I was doing some intermittent fasting, and my diet was relatively the same, meat and vegetables, and but I was getting to a point where didn't have to take insulin for like 12 hours, 16 hours. I think my longest without insulin was like 22 hours, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And my blood sugar was, perfect throughout that whole time. It wasn't like I just took it off and,
Mm-hmm.
accepted the consequences.
Right. And that was with eating too. Yeah.
Yep. And so that was with eating. And obviously it was very low carb, but yeah, it was a pretty eye-opening experience and like a very freeing experience. And then it all got derailed when I went on a mission trip to El Salvador for
That's right.
chiropractic, and I got a parasitic infection, and then
Mm.
it all went down the drain.
That's right. That's right. I forgot about that part of why it ended. But you were actually measuring at that time. You were measuring your C peptide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we were interested in seeing. I don't know why this marker is not measured in blood enough of type 1 diabetics, type 2 diabetics. In short, C peptide is a marker in your blood that measures directly how much insulin you are creating in your pancreas.
Mm-hmm.
And so as type ones, there's like little to none, like barely anything there. Sometimes it'll say like not readable on the blood lab. But if you're type two and you had insulin resistance, you might have a high C peptide, where type ones have a much lower. So, but
Mm-hmm.
you were actually measuring it, and you saw it didn't like go up a lot, right? But it did go up a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean,
Oh, that's right.
I didn't have a previous one to compare it to,
Yeah.
but it was, I mean, it wasn't unreadable. So there, I was producing some. It wasn't at the normal range at all,
Mhm.
but there was some there. But at the same time, like I said, I was doing intermittent fasting and low carb, so I also kind of wonder how much that affected things too, because my body didn't need to produce a lot of insulin, or it wasn't getting a lot of stimulation to produce insulin because I wasn't bringing a lot of sugar in.
Mhm.
So that may play a role in it as well. But ultimately, it still wasn't enough for fully getting off of insulin. But
Mhm.
it made me hopeful, and that's why I think I still haven't given up on it yet, is because I had such a good experience in the past and feel like I can get back to that and maybe hopefully find the missing pink piece to get me over that hump.
Sure. So let's I want to just take a second to protect your behinds a little bit right now. So we're not saying that you can fast your way out
Yeah,
of
don't.
diabetes. We're not we are not saying that Grady reverses diabetes, and we're not making any claims that you actually can. We're posing the question, is it possible? And like you said, it's complicated. That's the like answer, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
complicated is really the answer. um but and you haven't given up hope because some of the things you've seen, and you were essentially working with yourself
Mm-hmm.
as a patient and a doctor, and you have all this knowledge. So please do not, and we are not encouraging anyone just to start experimenting on yourselves to see how long you could go without insulin and think you can just not have diabetes, because type 1 is a condition, and when those beta cells are gone, it's a huge obstacle to navigate through, right?
Mm-hmm.
uh I myself, I don't think I can. If somebody asked me, is type 1 diabetes reversible, is type 1 diabetes reversible? My answer would pretty much be no. However, there is a honeymoon phase,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when you're still producing a lot of insulin and there's still beta cell function. Um, so if there were any possibility in my mind, based on the research of what I've read, to really have hope, if you catch somebody in that window and go and help their look at their gut, look at their immune system, and target those while being responsible and making sure people have healthy blood sugar levels, that is much more reasonable in my mind, and I think that's a much more worth attempt, of seeing what's possible, and can someone who's going down the type 1 diabetes route maybe not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've heard of some functional medicine doctors that have been able to either stop it or, in some ways reverse it in that early phase. It seems like it's much easier, I'll say, in that phase to,
Mhm.
catch it while it's kind of developing. Because once you've gotten so far, the immune system is a hard thing to change. So,
Right.
so there's a lot more that goes into it at that point. But yeah, I think if you're getting, or if you're in that honeymoon phase, or somebody that may be getting into it or has a possibility of it, you may look at some of these things in the functional medicine world, gut health, and some of the things that we're going to be talking about as far as trying to mitigate any risk and or just um, confusion by that immune system. So optimizing your immune system function um, is gonna be what you want to focus on.
Hmm. So in reality, we're not saying you treat the diabetes. We're saying, hey, what normal physiology can we restore?
Mm-hmm.
That's really the goal, and that's really how it should be thought about: is
Yeah.
what normal gut physiology can be restored, what normal immune physiology can be restored. And in a day and age where everyone's talking about the immune system, I think we need to think about the immune system differently in all conditions,
Mm-hmm.
and what's really going on. So, you know, diet is the first place to start.
Yep.
Lifestyle is the first place to start, and doing it with a practitioner who has studied and worked with people in this way is key, and making sure you're always being safe down that road. But anybody can just start changing their diet in any
Mm-hmm.
way, right? And
Yeah.
so you were eating mostly meat and veggies. I've heard people just only eating meat. I've heard people only eating veggies and some fruits, and then some being more omni, just being smart with how they um, use combination of all these things.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you said, it's so individualized.
Yeah.
There's no cookie cutter approach. There's no one way to this. This is, what is your immune system? What is your gut health? What makes it react so poorly? And then going from there.
Yep. Yep. And then beyond diet, there's a lot of other things that can be affecting your immune system. So things like environmental toxins, whether that's something in the air, something something in your water, something exposed on your skin or your hair, all those things play a role in how your immune system's reacting, because one, those things your immune system can react to. And at the same time, those things can really clog up your liver, because your liver has to try and detoxify those things. And when your liver gets really bogged down, then that can really affect your immune system as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then, heavy metal exposure, um, and subclinical infections, like I talked about, that parasitic infection that got me. that really threw things off. My immune system kind of went haywire again and threw it all off. So, I mean, there's a lot of things to think about. And so I think foundationally starting with the diet, like we said, is something that everybody can do and everybody can play with relatively safely. But ultimately, when it comes down to really, you know, picking through it with a fine comb and finding out what for you is the thing that's really triggering your immune system, is going to come down to you know, a practitioner that really knows what they're doing and knows how to search for those things. And
Mhm.
not saying that you like I said, not saying you're going to reverse these things, but ultimately, if you can help your immune system out, you're going to function much better. And
Right.
at the very least, your blood sugar is going to be much easier to control.
Right. Which ultimately, that really, that's how I've shifted my thinking more. What will make my blood sugar more easily controlled? What makes it more stable? What conditions can I create that allows me to do that? Because for me, I'm not as disciplined as you. Doing some of the things. I'm having a hard time getting back on intermittent fasting. Ever since I started running a lot. In fact, I think it was this date last year I finished my last marathon. And but ever since then I've been eating pretty moderate amount of carbs, and so um where was I going with this? But the idea of reversing or trying to really decrease the amount or reversing diabetes in my mind is gone. But how better can I make my blood sugar manageable? What immune state can I be in? How healthy can my immune system be? How healthy can my gut be? What really affects my gut? Are the questions that I ask myself, that I encourage others to ask. And if you get a cool result like you were seeing, that's even better.
Mm-hmm.
But that's on the list of possibilities, but that's not what I would hang my hat on. So it's, but not saying it's not possible. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think, you know, this study and this thought process is something that should be encouraging as far as if you're going to put your faith in a quote unquote cure. I think this is something you want to pursue
yeah,
versus waiting around and seeing if they come up with a cure in the medical field. Because ultimately, I'm sorry to say it, not likely at all, because there's not going to be one thing that's going to fix every person with type 1 diabetes.
right,
Like we said in this kind of this whole podcast, there's a lot of different things that come into play with this. And so if you're expecting one pill or one shot or one injection or whatever is going to fix your diabetes, I'm sorry, but that's just not going to happen. You
yep,
got to figure out why your body is doing what it's doing and then try and make that better.
right, exactly. So it's and some of the technology is really cool. Like the idea, like the main reason type 1 diabetes is a thing is because you don't have no more beta cells, you don't have insulin, there's no regulation of negative and positive feedback loops to control your blood sugar levels. So the thought would be, and what a lot of technology is trying to figure out, how do we regrow beta cells? And if we have more beta, if we get beta cell restoration, type 1 diabetes should be good to go. And they've, the injections and kind of encapsulated ways of growing beta cells are really interesting studies. But my question is then, all right, well, do you still have the antibodies?
Yeah.
Will your immune system still attack it? How long will those last? And if they can overcome some of those things, cool. But there's still other parts of those questions that likely aren't answered until we go down those roads. And this is the most conservative, the most close to your body is at functioning normally anyways. And so that should be, and something we can do literally starting within a second. You can start saying, right now I'm going to make these changes opposed to waiting, like you said, for a
Mm-hmm.
cure. Because I support the ADA and JDRF, and but I'm not gung-ho about, let's find a cure. I'm like, let's find technologies that make it easier to control. you
Mm-hmm.
know Dexcom, closed loop systems, mini meds, closed loop. These things are huge in creating a life that's much better for type 1 diabetic. That's what I really want to encourage people to really look at these companies for. Not so much, oh, there's gonna be a cure in your lifetime, because
Yeah.
you hear that too many times.
Yeah. Yeah. The other kind of motivation for adopting this kind of lifestyle and this pursuit is not only can you make your type 1 diabetes better or easier to control, but at the same time, you mitigate the risk of possibly developing another autoimmune
Right.
condition. Because it's very common for, if you have one autoimmune condition, you likely will develop another autoimmune condition,
Mhm.
especially if you continue doing the same things that you were doing leading
Mhm.
up to that first autoimmune condition. Because all the things that lead to one autoimmune condition likely going to lead to another one, because you're, like I said, your immune system is like attacking anything that looks foreign. If you're getting enough things in that look foreign, they may start mistaking your tissues for something that's foreign.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think the second most common autoimmunity for type 1 diabetic is Hashimoto's thyroiditis. And I think
Mm-hmm.
pretty sure that's the most common autoimmunity in the United States anyways. I need to double check those stats. I have those saved somewhere. But I have TPO antibodies, but doesn't mean, yeah, I have the antibodies, but as long as my immune system stays in control and I continue to work on my gut health and consistently, that consistent effort of experiment, okay, that was too much, let's go back, the
Mm-hmm.
consistent of what's really going on and how can I keep myself healthy, that's really going to determine. The antibodies don't determine it. Your immune system activity is what determines those things. And yeah, the likelihood of you having more than one is, once you get one, and that's for anything. If you already have RA, chances of you having another autoimmunity once you have rheumatoid arthritis is higher because you already have one. This is just a pattern of all autoimmunity.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So I actually once got in a pleasant discussion with endocrinologist once. I might have told the story on the podcast before. I can't remember. If he looks at my blood work and he looks at my TPO and opposed to saying TPO antibodies, and opposed to saying, what can we do? Like the discussion we're having here today, what can we do to make sure it doesn't happen? He just, oh, you're going to take thyroid medication later in your life. Like just, that was the first thought. He saw my blood work and he's like, oh, you're just be prepared. And I and
Wow.
I and I got pretty offended,
Yeah.
especially at that point as a future practitioner. At that point, of taking away hope from a patient like that was pretty, I thought, disrespectful.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's, what can I do today? It's, we've talked about this before. Once you look at yourself and say, you know, I have the power in my body, in my hands to be healthy. Some might see that as scary. Wow, that means every decision I make makes the condition worse. Well, the blunt truth of that is, yeah, that's correct. But the hopeful truth of that is every decision you make can influence the condition. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you, find the resource, and it's not easy, it's, finding the right team, and, then we can get in bigger conversations of who has those opportunities. And that's probably a much bigger scope of conversation than this podcast, because that can go in economic factors and so many disparities going on to that. I mean, hell, we talked about the price of insulin a couple of times, and we haven't even had a real conversation on the podcast about that at this
Mm-hmm.
point. But who the point being is, yeah, what you do has negative impacts, but what you do has positive impacts too. It's you yourself have given up hope on you. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't look at that myself, even that I don't, like, I'm trying to not do these things for the similar motivations you are, doesn't mean that I'm not happy and I'm motivated to make my life better and healthier. And those who I work with, I feel the same. All the patients that I work with, I always try to inspire hope. And then if you have hope, that change is way easier to make than it without it being there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely.
So that being said, we talked about hope. Let's bust it down. Let's bust down the hell. What's been bursting your beta cells, Grady?
Oh man. Let's see.
I got one on
Go
deck.
for it.
All right. So, um, so what's been bursting my beta cells, and again, is this whole insurance racket. And so I had insurance change not too long ago, and now it's time. I had a stock supply that I've been weaning through and saving money because I ordered a little too. I mean, how many people that use pumps use more reservoirs than they do infusion sets? or vice versa, rather. They use more infusion sets, so you have a stock of reservoirs, right?
Yeah.
And so, I was just going through my supply, and now it's time to order. So I call my new insurance to say what's covered, what's not. And I had a long list. Is Dexcom covered? Yes or no? What medical supplier should I go through? Give me the names, numbers, whatever else. And then I started asking about pump supplies. And then I was like, okay, so I know you cover Dexcom. I know you cover Medtronic. And I assume the supplies are covered, but I want to make sure. What about the Medtronic reservoirs, whatever? And he goes, well, sir, since these are covered, it should be good. And he was referring to Dexcom. I was like, no, I need to know the supplies. What are those covered? And I could tell he was getting frustrated because this was like 15 minutes on the phone, only 15.
Yeah.
And he says, well, sir, you probably need to go to your doctor, get the CPT code, have them look it up and let you know. And I literally paused, like, you want me to do your job for you right now? Okay, I'll go on Google. And I Googled Medtronic reservoir CPT code. And so for all those out there, a CPT code is essentially a code for insurance purposes of therapies or medications. It's a number associated with something to get reimbursed by insurance companies, more or less, right? And so I just looked up CPT code for these things, and I said, why don't you check A3529, whatever? And looked at, yep, that's covered. And then so we kept going on. Very nice guy. But if I just accepted that at that moment, it would have hung up the phone, been on the hold with my hospital for 5-10 minutes, talked to somebody. They would be probably confused. They would look it up. It would have been another 2-hour process. And so I know that instantly in the back of my head. So I'm talking to this guy, finish all my questions. It ends up being like a 40-minute conversation for this first stage of calls. And I haven't even done my other stage of calls of contacting the medical suppliers yet. But I said, sir, you've been really great. However, if you took a little bit more energy and just literally Googled, because that's what I did, and asked a little more questions about what I wanted you to Google, you could have looked up this answer, because I know you know this information. And I only know it because of my career, because I am too, a physician. And somebody who isn't that would have spent 2 hours, and you would have wasted somebody's 2 hours of their life. And that's
For
not
5 minutes.
For five, not even,
Yeah.
And I said it, I thought respectfully, but in a way that I hopefully he got. I mean, everyone has bad days, whatever, but
Yeah.
just when you always spend so much time figuring out how to pay for diabetes, on the phone for diabetes, trying to figure out your supply, there's just so much extra stuff to get to. For someone to just say, oh, call your doctor and find out when you can have the bill, it really burst my beta cells. And so that was this week, and that really burst my beta cells again. Just the whole insurance game is just a too much of a racket than it needs to be.
Yeah. Well, let's give you a hand of applause for being an advocate for not only yourself, but for future people asking those questions.
I will be here all week.
Yeah, that made me feel good. Your response to him. Because I mean, it's already frustrating trying to talk to them, and then when they can't even really do their own job and you got to do it for them, I mean, that's just even more frustrating.
Oh yeah.
Luckily, I mean, the insurance company I have, or at least the guy that I talked to last time, and we had to figure a whole bunch of stuff out. He was really good about. Yeah. He even like called the pharmacy while I was still on the phone and went through that whole process with me. So that was really nice. But yeah, it can be really, especially after you've already waited on hold for however long, like hours at a time sometimes.
Absolutely. It's not worth it's so everything about insurance is built and designed to save the insurance company money. It's not meant to give you the care that you're trying to seek out. Fundamentally, it is for profit. Yep. And there's so many things, and I don't even want to go on an insurance rant right now, but in my office, in terms of my chiropractic practice, we are in so many insurances, and I've learned lots of frustrating things about a lot of different insurances, and sometimes they don't even know how their stuff works, and and I do, and I have to explain why I know it, and it's way too frustrating. And anybody out there, you're not alone, and so everything everyone agrees, it's messed up.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you had a good advocate for your policy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So mine is not quite as intense as yours, but my burst my beta cells is when you get into the shower, and that's when you realize that your port site is about to come off, and then you got to hold it the whole time you're in the shower, otherwise it's going to come off because of the water.
Yeah, too much good pressure, too much good water pressure. Yeah, you're holding it on, and the water's going down your body, and you don't want it to go in, so you hold. Yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, that happened to me this morning, and I'm like, gosh, now I gotta like shower with one hand, and then just annoying.
It's one part of diabetes that only diabetics would know.
Yeah.
Like that's so. You just met a random type 1 diabetic on the street and said, "Hey, how many times has your pump thing almost fallen off in the shower?" And they were just laughing, I'm sure, because we've been there.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that has kind of burst my beta cells for sure. So right on. So appreciate everyone for listening to this discussion. Hopefully we took a concept that can be confusing or new and explain it in a way that made sense. And that's from the American Diabetes Association itself. And if you guys have any questions about these type of things, let us know via social media or email or whatever. Appreciate anyone who already messages us, because we always have fun interacting with y'all privately as well. And so we're starting to experiment with Clubhouse. So we may or may not do some Diet Buddy stuff on Clubhouse. So if you're all on there, we'll probably have something. I don't even know how it works. I just got on it. But it's a voice only social media app. And so I think it might allow us to have almost like live Q&A podcasts or just live interaction podcasts. So we'll figure out. I don't know. But if you're on there, let us know. And so with all that being said, hope everyone has a great day, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the Diet Buddies podcast.
See ya.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you found value in today's conversation, we would appreciate it if you gave a 5-star review. It really helps us branch out our community and get our message across to those who really need to hear it. If you want to interact with us on social media, you can follow us on the Diet Buddies podcast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Or if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or moral outrages, you can email us at thedietbuddiespodcast@gmail.com. Thanks.